Thanks, and thanks for a great talk, Grace. So yeah, I had a couple of questions, and maybe they're all sort of slightly different takes on the same question. But when we think about testing tools, it seems like uh, what we really care about is whether the tool tells us something about how the system works, right? And so I guess my biggest question is like if an artificial neural network has different kinds of circuits than a brain does, then it seems like figuring out which tools work well for even like a wide range of artificial neural networks might not shed light on whether it's any good for how brains work, unless you know that it is looking at just those aspects of the neural network that we already know are shared between brains and neural networks. So I was wondering if you could say something about that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think, you know, as I said, I think there are the elements where they are we kind of can say that they are the same. And to the extent that we apply the same tools across individuals, across species, and all of that, we're acknowledging that there can be some differences, and a tool can still work. I think so. In kind of thinking about what is the toolbox of systems neuroscience, I was focusing on and found plenty of examples where I don't think there's anything about the tool and how people interpret its results that suggests that people are thinking of the brain as anything other than how we think of artificial neural networks. It's like you have individual units, they produce distributed representations over a population, they connect to each other, there can be recurrence and dynamics, but like systems neuroscientists usually think of neurons kind of as point neurons. And so it just seems like there is already a sense that we're assuming the brain is artificial neural network like and doing analyses and creating stories that have that kind of baked in. Now, if that's the wrong way to think about it, then that's already a problem for kind of the whole systems neuroscience approach. But if that's an okay way to think about it, then I think the domain of circuits that these tools should be applicable to should apply to artificial neural networks as well.
Yeah, so I'm really sympathetic with that last set of things that you said. It seems like systems neuroscientists, like neurobiologists, are working in sort of the same kind of abstraction space. But maybe just as an example, like you might think that we know that some of the statistical properties of activity in artificial neural networks are different, like you just mentioned, noise correlations. And it seems like, given that we don't have a full understanding of how particular kinds of tests are performed by the brain, it might be that some of the statistical properties that we see in brains are artifacts and not important to the functioning. And similarly, some of the statistical properties that we see in the artificial neural networks could also be artifacts and not important to the functioning. And if that's true, then it might be that you have a tool that does a really good job of, I don't know, saying something about what the model system will do, given that it has these certain statistical features, but that connection won't generalize to what's happening in brains.
Yeah, it's
Sorry.
definitely a concern. Yeah. I mean, it's totally possible. And that's why I think, testing the tools on a variety of different artificial neural networks that have some variability on these domains. I mean, the kind of noise element is particularly hard to transfer to artificial neural networks because you have to just assume that it is kind of true randomness and just put that into the activity, like just have the activity draw from a probability distribution instead of being deterministic. Whereas in the brain, the things we call noise are, sometimes thought to be random and sometimes thought to be factors, external to the exact experimental setup. So I think that particular thing that neuroscientists focus on is something that yeah, it would be hard to apply in neural networks and to like claim that you can say anything about the analysis of the brain based on neural networks for that one. But yeah, for other methods and if you test on a diverse enough set of architectures and tasks and things like that, I still think you be in the realm of finding something useful about the tool. I mean, even to the extent that how often does it give you a good inspiration for a new experiment? I don't even know how often people think about that in terms of how well their tools are working. Like, what can you do with the information that this analysis gave you? Just even kind of, yeah, pinpointing that kind of thing, I think still could be useful. But yeah, it's technically an empirical question as to whether how well these tools work on the artificial neural networks, tells us how well they work on the brain. But given that we're not explicitly looking into that in the real neural data, this is maybe a way to start looking into it in a way that you can iterate faster.
Okay, so like maybe it's not perfect, but it's better than not doing it at all, which is what we would
Yes.
be doing if we were only testing it on the brain. Okay. Okay, so this second kind of question I had is, you suggest that sometimes we might add in properties that aren't present by default in neural networks. So like you mentioned Dale's law and sparsity. And I guess I was wondering, like, some of these properties, like, it's not obvious how they contribute to the capacities of the system, right? Like, it's not obvious that, like, having only a single neurotransmitter for a single kind of neuron is that important to it doing what it does. So adding that in seems like it might be, making the neural network, artificial neural network, look more like the brain in ways that are, I don't know, like very salient to us. But maybe it's like painting feathers on an airplane. Like it doesn't make it fly better. It makes it look more like the thing that we know flies. So I guess I'm wondering like why would we ever add in a property when we didn't already know how it worked, like how it contributed?
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that, and I do think when people add details, not even for the purposes of kind of testing the tools, but just using these as models, that they have to have a good reason for why they're adding this specific detail, and have at least a hypothesis about the role it will play in the trained network. I think though there is, there the individual kind of biological feature is multifaceted, or you can have some sense of one role that it plays, but you want to know what role it plays in a broader sense. So like in the example that I showed of putting circuits that have E and I cells into a framework that's more like convolutional neural network, that's actually like my own work, and so I know why I did that. But so that was we had a understanding of the role that circuitry played kind of in a single visual area. And so the question was kind of how would it interact if you had that circuitry repeating across the visual hierarchy, and how can you prove that kind of computation that circuit does can actually play a role in the broader goal of object recognition that the ventral stream has. So it was kind of connecting the lower level role of the circuit details with the higher computations, and kind of proving that it could play a useful role in the broader computation. But yeah, just adding things in and then training a network and seeing what it does with it, you can get something out of that. I think that can inspire some hypotheses about the role of that feature. Some people add recurrence to convolutional neural networks and show that it makes them more robust to noise and things like that. And it's just, it's something you can show, and then you can say, oh, there's a relationship between recurrence and robustness and that. So you can come in a little bit hypothesis-less and explore, but yeah, it's better if you have a good sense of what the detail is for and why you're adding it, and in this case, why it's a relevant detail to test a specific tool. And yeah, you want the network to actually be kind of using that detail in the right way before you add the tool. But I don't think you have to have a complete sense of what the real brain uses it for. I think it's fine to kind of bootstrap. You have some sense of what it's doing in the real brain, you get it to do that in artificial neural network, and then move on from there.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure if this is what you're saying, but it sounds like maybe what we really want is maybe not to add in like a particular feature, but rather like the constraint that we think generates that feature in the brain.
Sure, that's one way you could put it, yeah.
So I think you also mentioned sparsity, and I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about like, what role we think that plays in real brains and why I like adding it. Because adding it to an artificial neural network sort of helps independently of whether we think activity is sparse in the real brain.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of kind of theory around why sparsity is important or makes sense in the real brain, and a lot of discussion about representations in the brain. It matters if you're assuming a sparse or a non-sparse representation. So just to align with or to test certain tools that come from a certain kind of history in systems neuroscience, there might be an assumption that the activity should be sparse. And that is something you could put into a neural network. And that's an example of one where I think if you put it in, there's a sense that the network is using it. Like you've changed the representation, the network can't get around the fact that it's sparse. It has to work with the sparse representation if you put this penalty in and it successfully sparsified the representation. So that's one where it's just kind of, if it's in there, the network's using it. I don't think that's the same as like painting feathers on an airplane. So there are some, where you can put it in and kind of go forth with just the knowledge that the representation is sparse. And so any analysis that assumes sparsity, you can apply to this representation.
And I think my last question is maybe more general. So I was wondering whether it could be the case that you have very similar statistical properties among systems that actually are doing something quite different in an underlying way. Like if the statistical property that you're measuring again is something that isn't essential to what they're doing, and like how you could tell.
Yeah.
In the cases where the tools are focusing in on these statistical properties.
Well, I think that's where this kind of like closed loop idea comes in, because if you do an experiment that says, this property that I've identified is important causally for how the system works, and so if I perturb that property, I'm going to change how the system works, and then you perturb it and nothing changes, then you've shown that it's kind of epiphenomenal, or you've not identified the thing that you thought that you were identifying. So I think
I don't know if you've shown it yet when you do that, right? Because it might be that like the only way that you have of perturbing that statistical property is by also changing something that actually does matter.
Yeah, I think in the case of artificial neural networks, you have a better chance of being able to separate things. And not perfect, but in theory, because you can really very artificially break causal connections in an artificial neural network. So in theory, you might be able to do at least more than you could experimentally in terms of trying to figure out if something is very important or is just kind of correlated with something that's important or is just unrelated entirely. But yeah, again, it can't be perfect. So.
Well, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosa. So before giving the floor to Matteo, so there's a question from Joseph that you can. So when I said right question on the chat, so it didn't mean right the proper question, but just the word question, so and so. And now I can leave the floor to Joseph. Joseph is unmuted, Marco.
Yes. Yes. Hi. Thanks for such a wonderful talk. I was wondering, there's a very obvious difference between AI and the human brain, where AI has software and hardware, whereas the human brain is the software is the hardware. And I wonder if that would be a problem when we try to experiment from one to the other.
So I think in the case of artificial neural networks in particular, this notion that they're a black box, I think, is pointing to the idea that we're kind of in the same position with those as we are with the brain, where the software and the hardware are mixed up. Now, obviously, the actual hardware of the computer, we know, but when people think about understanding artificial neural networks, they're not thinking about the hardware that they're running on. They're just thinking about, you have this system that has this set of weights that implements a function. And how do we make sense of kind of the subcomponents of what it's doing? So yeah, the actual physical separation is different, but kind of conceptually it gets wrapped up again if you're just thinking about artificial neural networks versus different types of artificial intelligence, like more symbolic artificial intelligence. Maybe I wouldn't claim that you can test anything about neuroscience tools on like those kinds of models, but specific to artificial neural networks, I think you again get kind of wrapped up if you think of the hardware as like the neurons and the software as whatever computations they're implementing.
Interesting. Thank you so much.
Okay, so if Matteo agrees, there's another question from Bartos. I don't know if can I pronounce him correctly. So Marco, can I unmute?
Hey,
Bartos?
thanks for the talk. I had a question about simulations. And my question is basically, what can simulations of the brain tell us about the brain? My understanding of a simulation is that it shows whatever the modeling assumptions entail, but they cannot show anything beyond what the set of axioms, so to say, already specifies. And to me, it seems that you need an additional theory of how to relate the simulation and its assumptions to the brain. But isn't that precisely the problem we are trying to solve, to find the sort of theory? Thanks.
So I think so in kind of very simple models, yeah, there's a lot of, you put in the details from the biology that you're studying, and you're not going to get so much more out of it than what you put in. Usually in those kinds of more simplified in computational neuroscience, these are kind of the more historical kind of circuit models and things like that. There, the goal is to show that everything can kind of fit together. Like if I believe that the anatomy of this neural circuit is responsible for a specific type of neural dynamics, well, I can build a model that has the same anatomy and show that it produces the same neural dynamics. And then that way you're not kind of getting anything you didn't know out, you're just connecting two pieces of data and saying this one piece of data of the anatomy can lead to this other piece of data of the dynamics. In these artificial neural networks, though, because they are trained to perform a task, meaning the experimenter isn't responsible for setting all the details of the model, specifically the weights between the neurons, then you kind of do end up with something that's, more than you put in. You have now a system that can perform a task, but you can't say which parts of the system are responsible for which parts of performing the task, because you've just trained this big system to do it and it can do it. So that's, to me, why they are an interesting parallel to the brain, because despite the fact that we built them, they actually have something that we don't understand in them, and we can't, we don't know how they create the match to behavior that they are capable of creating. So I think, yeah, in these networks where you're training them in some way, you have the possibility to get something out that you didn't put in, and then that can be the object of study.
Thank you very much. So, Matteo, thanks for having waited. Matteo, sure.
Thank you very much, Grace, for sharing your paper for your talk. I have two sets of questions. The first is about the why artificial neural networks are suitable. So section 3 of your paper. Specifically, I was asking myself, what's exactly distinctive about artificial neural networks as testing grounds for the tools of system neuroscience compared to simple model organisms? During your talk, you mentioned the C. elegans. Okay? For C. elegans, we have the full connectome already. And I think also in terms of manipulability or perturbability, now with optogenetics, that's a model organism that is also fully manipulable. So I was just wondering what might be a salient difference between, say, making generalizations from very simple model organisms to, human brains compared to artificial neural networks. So that's my first question.
Yeah, I mean, I think they both have their role. I would say, I mean, when I talk to people who study C. elegans, I don't think that they feel like they can perfectly observe or manipulate their experimental object. So I think there actually is still, even in the simplest experimental setting, there is still a difference between how easy it is to observe and perform experiments, and especially to kind of be certain that there aren't any unknowns that you're not capturing, so that you don't have that risk of that hidden causal factor. I think even in a petri dish, even in C. elegans, there's always a risk that there's something that you're not aware of that's happening in your system. Whereas with an artificial neural network, you have the entire thing. You can't get around your observations. So I think that's important. And I mean, you could argue that also because the artificial neural networks can be trained to perform kind of what would be more described as like cognitive tasks or things that are more specific to what we study in macaques or humans, that maybe that's a benefit of testing out certain tools there as well. And I would say also that you have the ability to kind of build as a bunch of different architectures and test it on a wide range of different kind of organisms versus just relying on like the one organism that we have some slight controllability over. That would be a benefit as well. But yeah, obviously we should be thinking about the lessons that we learned from C. elegans, and people do that, with the connectome example. Like people use that to say, oh, maybe knowing connectivity isn't the end of it that we thought things were. That didn't solve all of our problems. And I think that's a great example of a reflection on what we were trying to do, the information we were trying to get out of system, realizing that it wasn't actually going to guarantee us the progress that we assumed. So I think that, yeah, doing that in a simple organism can work as well.
Excellent, thanks. My second set of questions is about the closed loop understanding that you lay out in your paper and also during your talk. Specifically, I have two questions in relation to this closed loop understanding idea. One is, what's exactly the relationship between understanding and compressibility or low dimensionality? That's something that you do mention as a view in your paper, which you do not obviously endorse, I don't know. So I just wanted to hear a bit more. How do you see the relationship between understanding and this compressibility or low dimensionality?
Yeah, so that is like a view that's talked about in systems neuroscience a bit with there's a paper by Cording and Lillicrap about kind of defining that as a form of understanding. And I am sympathetic to that because, I mean, kind of obviously you can't say that understanding is just listing all of the data points you collected. Like once if people just published their tables of data, science wouldn't be progressing very well. You want all the words around it where people interpret the data and say what they think the data means and all of that. So I think if you really reflect on it, almost any neuroscientist would say compressibility is part of understanding. You don't just want to share a full data set. You want to know what people took away from it, and that's means that you're sharing a compressed view of that data. So I think that is important to it. And I mean, there are other things that are important. I mean, accuracy of the kind of compressed view is important as well, but there's an inherent trade-off there where the more compressed you make it, the less precise you can be in how you're saying something works, and possibly less accurate. And so there is a concern there, and that is where I think kind of the field needs to in part acknowledge that this has subjectivity to it, and that different people are striving for different things. But I also think there's probably some, and this is where I'm also sympathetic with the idea of maybe redefining our goals. Some of the things that people want, or some of the things that people put forward as explanations or as a form of understanding, kind of aren't, almost, in the sense that they don't lead to productive next steps. They don't get kind of verified. They're just, and again, to some extent this will be subjective, but just some of these kind of explanations just seem either too vague, or an explanation that is actually just a redescription that's kind of just describing the data, but isn't providing any additional kind of causal links between how it works. I think people need to be on the lookout for that, but I don't have a very good sense of what understanding is in any kind of universal way, because partly I don't think there is a universal sense. Even within systems neuroscience, there's a lot of diversity.
Excellent, because this naturally leads me to my final question. Now you pointed out the three possible dimensions of understanding. That is the compressibility aspect, the accuracy aspect, and the causal aspect. And one question I have is about the similarity aspect. That is, you have a model and a target, and you want to ask how similar are these two things? What are metrics that might be suitable to say that a model is like the brain or is similar to the brain? I'm asking this question because I read recently a paper presenting two measures of similarity. One was based on hierarchical homology, and the other one was based on predictive accuracy. And so my question is, first, do you think these scores or measures of similarity are any fruitful when it comes to, providing understanding? And the second question is about the predictive accuracy. That is, do you think there is anything more to explanation than predictions under a different range of manipulations? That is, if you manipulate the system and you find out that your predictions are accurate, what more do you need for an explanation?
Yeah. So measures of similarity, I think, I do fall far on the side of when I want to understand a system, what I mean is I want to build like a causal mechanistic model of it. That's like what understanding is to me. And when people provide things that they describe as understanding but don't do that, I think they're confused or it's not understanding to me. So whether a given similarity metric is useful, that would to me kind of depend on whether it's comparing two systems based on kind of the dimensions that matter for those systems. Kind of as Rosa was saying, there could be things that we can analyze, that we focus on and we talk about, but they're not actually somehow super causal to the production of the behavior of interest or anything like that. So I wouldn't say, I can't say beforehand if a similarity metric is useful, because I would have to think about whether the thing it's measuring in each system is of importance. And the predictive element, so there's people criticize comparing artificial neural networks to the brain using just how well can you predict neural activity from brain activity, from the artificial neural activity. And because it's like, oh, well, you can predict the neural activity, but what does that tell us about the neural activity? It just says this system that we don't understand can predict this system that we don't understand. And I'm sympathetic to that. I still think it's an important step in saying that you've built like a good model, because eventually we should be able to predict neural activity in response to specific stimuli. But the kind of types of predictions that I think that, kind of show that a tool is useful is more based on kind of just hypotheses and experimental predictions. Not can you predict neural activity in response to the same image, but can you come up with in your mind a guess about what will happen in an experiment and be correct? And so that, again, it really is kind of the human comprehensible element of the description that matters for understanding in my perspective, because again, yeah, you could create a giant model that maybe predicts the output of an experiment, but if you couldn't do it in your head, then it's like not really understanding. And that unfortunately relates to the problem of maybe we just can't have the type of understanding we want for the brain because we're relying on the constraints of our cognition. But yeah, I think there is something to the idea that the experimenter sits down with their kind of cartoon picture of how they think the system works and is able to get something done with that turns out to be correct, or makes them able to predict what will happen in an experiment.
Thanks, Grace. That was really helpful.
And thanks, Matteo, for your nice questions. Now, I see that one of the attendees, Kaizen Fakar, hope the pronounce is correct, is using a button involving hands. So I'm Kaizen. I am unmuting you just in case you wanna make a question.
Yeah, actually, no, I just wanted to congratulate and like clap. But
Okay.
it stayed there, I guess, for a very long time. So sorry for that. I didn't know what to do with how could I not clap,
Oh, wow. We
Yeah.
can easily imagine you're clapping forever.
Yeah,
Very-
that was happening. But yeah, worth it. So clapping forever works.
Thanks. So this leaves room for further questions. So for instance, welcome, Simon.
Hello. Thanks for your presentation. I think because we didn't talk about this too much today, but finding out how our methods work, if they truly brings us closer to the truth, is important is not easy question to answer. Yes, so tackling this problem is hard, and you showed us that we have like two reasons to think why we should maybe use your proposition. One is that idea that artificially we will be able to make those quasi experiments to quasi test our methods faster and find out if they truly find what we think what they're supposed to find. And the second is that there will be less appealing, especially in the system science, to say something like, but probably there is another system that do this and this, and that's the answer to our question. And like because we are dealing here with the question about the developing of science. Also, in the answering to the previous question, you said that we would like the kind of explanation to say us what do in the next step. Yes. So, for example, one can understand that maybe someone from system science, when he insists that probably there is another module that will make something, is making exactly this. So this is like showing us the next step where we can go to find something new about our brains. And so the question is, because I think maybe this is not elaborated in your presentation, that what kind of the clues about what to do next could your perspective bring us?
So, yeah, you can't argue that, positing a causal factor that you didn't observe is grounds for the next experiment. And that's true, and that's how it would work, in real experiments where things are limited. I think this is where kind of the 2 points converge a little bit about this expedites the process, and it makes you not able to claim extra causal factors. Basically, if I did that kind of motor experiment on an artificial neural network, and I said, oh, I think that means there's something else that's introducing this delay, well, I would just immediately check if I could find that. It wouldn't be something that I posit that, then lingers in the literature for a while as a possibility or anything like that. It would just be something you could immediately check. And also, I mean, to some extent, it would pop out maybe on its own because you'd already start by looking at everything. You wouldn't restrict your analysis to a subset of the neural activity. So just you could say that having limited access and kind of inferring from what you've observed that there's something else that you haven't observed does provide a next step. But in an artificial neural network, you can test that next step way quicker as well. So that's kind of a benefit of it. I think the other ideas of what kind of next steps could come out of the analysis methods is mostly a function of what the analysis method is. It's kind of baked into a little bit, the type of analysis that you're doing, especially for the more kind of hypothesis-driven types of methods. I mean, dimensionality reduction and visualization is usually kind of open-ended in what kind of things it's going to inspire you to think about. But other types of methods, have a little bit more built in, where it's kind of, if you find a significant result, there's kind of a natural, I think, extension of how you would act on that. But yeah, it's going to depend on the method, and determining, as I said, kind of to what extent different methods actually provide good inspiration for experiments is part of this process. Because sometimes there could be, methods that we're applying and we're happy to just kind of leave them there and not follow up on the analysis that they, or the understanding that they kind of put forth. Or, it's just kind of a vague sense of this adds to a pile of understanding of this system. But being very explicit in kind of acknowledging that some methods are better at producing actionable experiments than others seems like something we should be thinking about in terms of evaluating our methods.
Thanks. So we're still time for more questions. So don't be shy and jump in. And if you feel that the question you have in mind is silly, then let me speak a real silly question, which is, well, I mean, one thing I have, it's only, it's a pragmatic rather than a theoretical question. But when I've heard people discussing the future of using artificial neural networks for modeling the brain, one concern that sometimes comes out is about the ecological sustainability, not ecological validity. Well, also ecological validity, but I also hear that the bigger they are, the more they draw in terms of energy. And so, since we are all compelled by our status as academics to be, or at least to pretend to be, very sensitive about the environment, and since we have a big increase in Europe of the prices of electricity, now, joking apart, have your community of computational neuroscientists discuss about the issue of the bigger we build them, the hungrier they are in terms of electricity? So how can we manage that? You build smaller ones, more focus, or you just try to find solar power? I mean, I'm just curious about these technicalities. That's still, thanks.
Yeah, so yeah, people do talk about this. I mean, so in computational neuroscience, people haven't actually grappled with it that much. It's more in kind of applied ML where people are talking about this more because they're more using larger ones and all of that. So yeah, ideally you would be using a compute cluster at your university or things like Google Cloud that are supposed to be carbon neutral when you're running those computers. Also, a lot of these networks, you can just download pre-trained versions if you're using kind of standard networks. So most of the energy cost is in training, not in running the network. So you can download ones where the training is already done. If you're interested in kind of very commonly used architectures and tasks, and then you don't have to worry about that kind of energy costs, and you can just analyze the responses and perform small experiments and stuff. But that's nowhere near the energy intensity of the training process.
Thank you. Very cool. So a caveat, an implication of what you're just saying is that by incentivizing sharing in science, when it comes to sharing pre-trained networks, you will not only cut down the time people will spend to make advances, but also you will cut down the energy, right?
Yeah, and especially for certain architectures, the training procedure is very finicky, and you have to get all of the hyperparameters just right for it to work. And so people can end up wasting a lot of time and energy trying to re-implement a model that they read about versus if they could just download it already trained and not have to worry about kind of the finickiness of the training process.
Thank you. Not very theoretically relevant, I admit, but maybe of interest for social epistemologists of science. They're very much into this. Also, lots of neuroscientists are advocating this, and I can see why a little more clear. Thank you. So
after Marco's question, I also feel allowed to make a naive question. So as you said, the computational, I'm not familiar with computational neuroscience, but it seems to me dominated by artificial neural networks. So it was not so in the past, so at least for cognitive science. So I'm a bit more expert about the computational modeling of language, and that's until some years ago there was just logical based and not connectionist systems to model language, even in the case of, for instance, modeling patient data or syndromes. And now they are starting to use neural networks also in that field. But so neural networks have some computational limitations, at least in the case of language, that are still for the moment, they are very well known and they are not solved. For instance, they can model compositionality, for instance, in a language, or the ability to produce complex language statements from the basis and other stuff. And there seems, as far as I know, there's no way to solve this problem with artificial neural networks. They are using for doing a lot of very interesting stuff because their statistical powers is absolutely great, so they can make a lot of things, but there seems to be some limitation that cannot be overcome. So what's on the other hand, as far as I know, there is no attempt at all to use other computational systems rather than artificial neural networks. So the field seems to be, from an external point of view, I repeat, I'm not familiar, completely dominated by artificial neural networks. So what's your feeling about this? So do you think that in the future, so it would be worse in this sense, so artificial neural network will dominate the entire field, or you still see some room for other formalism? So thank you.
Yeah, so in computational neuroscience generally, I mean, I don't know much specifics about language modeling, but in computational neuroscience, it is the case that the use of artificial neural networks has become much more popular lately. And this was mainly started from results in the visual system showing that you could use trained artificial neural networks to predict real neural activity better than any other method that we had tried before that. And so that kind of set off, people wanting to study those models and to train models on other systems and try to compare and all of that. I think so, but this is, not so dissimilar from the kind of boom that happened in like the 80s around parallel distributed processing and connectionism, kind of the original artificial neural networks in cognitive science and in neuroscience. And so I think it's fine for people to explore where this tool is useful, because there were big advances on the machine learning side in terms of being able to train these models and get them to do interesting things. And one thing that was kind of lacking in computational neuroscience was models that could actually do things. We had models that could explain neural activity. We had models that could, like people would study memory, but obviously you'd have to define memory in this very like low level cellular way and say, well, when these neurons are active, that means the memory was reinstated and that kind of thing. But to have a network that can actually perform the same task that you can give a human or an animal in a study, like show it the same image and have it produce the same kind of slightly complex cognitive output that you're interested in studying. I mean, that's important, and we shouldn't pass up that opportunity in computational neuroscience. So I'm, on the whole, I'm happy to see people exploring it in multiple regimes of neuroscience. I've seen a lot of not great work using trained artificial neural networks as attempts to try to say something about the brain. So as with any method, you have to understand them and you have to be careful in how you use them, and you have to make sure that you're asking well-posed questions and make sure that the connection to how we're supposed to learn about the brain from them is clear and all of that. But I don't think that they're going to dominate and displace any other type of computational neuroscience. I think that they can kind of interact decently well with other arms of computational neuroscience, because, as I said, you can kind of bring in more details. The fact that we have all these detailed biological, sometimes like very biophysical models of how neurons work and all of that, there is the opportunity to bring some of those details into these networks and use the existing mathematical frameworks that computational neuroscientists have created for them. And there are ways of kind of connecting them to more cognitive type models of thinking about like how the brain and behavior connect and all of that. And so I think that they can fit in well if they're used well. But I think there will also be, as in the previous wave, there's going to be this explosion and then there's going to be a die down, and there's already some backlash and all of that. So I don't think that they're going to be the only method that people use in computational neuroscience now or in the future.
Yeah, thanks. That's probably because there's this hype in neural networks. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thanks. I see that Santiago is also willing to make a question. Santiago, if you don't mind, I will let you speak your question directly. It's easier than read it. Welcome.
Hi guys. Thanks, Chris, for that awesome talk. I guess, yeah, I've been also working a lot with neural networks and trying to gain insights about specifically visual processing in the brain. And I found it actually kind of hard actually the knowledge that I've gained from neurophysiology experiments have shaped the way in which I studied deep neural networks. So rather, the traditional approaches to neuroscience have shaped the way in which I actually study deep neural networks. So making this flip to use insights that deep neural networks produce to understand neuroscience has been somewhat challenging. So I guess, yeah, my first question to you would be, do you have specific examples? Because I understand the deep neural networks are kind of cheap and a very efficient way to generate hypotheses. They're very capable. But do you have specific examples of how people have used them to generate specific hypotheses that have led to discoveries about visual processing in the brain or any type of processing in the brain?
So the kind of basic result that if you train a convolutional neural network to perform object recognition, that you can predict neural activity along the ventral stream at multiple different areas in the ventral stream. I think that alone has given us some insights. One of the things generally that if you train an artificial neural network to do a task, and then that lets you predict neural activity in a certain brain region very well, that gives you some assurance that that brain region is probably executing something like that task in the real brain. So that's one way that people interpret these results, is that basically by fiddling around with how you train the neural network, you can kind of define the computational goal of a brain area. If you can say, oh, it looks like this brain area is very involved in this task because it looks the same as the artificial neural network that does the task. So that's one kind of general way that people do that, and that's been applied, in the visual system, also in different subcomponents of the visual system. So you can train the neural network on images of scenes instead of zoomed in images of objects, and you'll get different brain areas that you're able to predict. So because parts of the visual system are specialized for things like scene processing. And in other sensory systems, people have applied this, like in the auditory system. There's been explorations about kind of what kind of sounds you need to train the neural network on to get good neural productivity, which can tell you something about, kind of the properties of sounds that the auditory system probably evolved or developed to detect. And there's also been some kind of work with varying architectures to kind of identify the role of different architectural components. I mentioned briefly this idea that, you can add recurrence to a neural network, and that can make it better at certain more challenging visual tasks like noise, interpreting noisy images and that kind of thing. So that's a way where people use them to find the connection between a biological detail and some aspect of task performance or some abilities about the brain. There have been other things more recently, trying to remember specifically, but yeah, there was something about things related to hippocampus people have done. We can't remember the specific details because I'm not that well versed in the hippocampus literature, but I know that artificial neural networks have been recently applied to understanding various things about hippocampus as well, kind of in this general vein of showing the task that it was trained on, but also I think there's a larger component to it that is making neuroscientists, as I've been talking about, rethink exactly what understanding looks like. I think it's helped push neuroscientists away from single cell analysis, which historically has been the focus. And that was really due to the experimental limitations that you could, at least in like the 60s, you could basically only record from one neuron at a time in a lot of brain areas. And so people started developing all these methods for understanding the responses of a single neuron, instead of thinking about populations of neurons and how they represent information and transform information. So I think there's been partly a push of trying to not understand individual neurons and their tuning properties, but to think more in terms of populations and to think more in terms of the fact that, an individual neuron is going to not map very neatly to the real world. It's going to have messy responses to things in the real world, but that doesn't matter because it's part of a population. So yeah, there are some specific results, and then there's also what I would say is more of a philosophical shift that focusing on these networks has kind of not initiated, because people were already a bit in that direction, but has certainly made clear is the right direction to go in and kind of expedited that shift to the population focus.
I see. Thanks a lot. So basically, from what I got from what you said, is you were talking about Mars level of understanding based on this prediction accuracy, and because these networks have been trained on, say, object recognition, then it's a rather, say, normative account, like computational account of different visual areas or different brain areas, but they do not so far have provided understanding at a more, the implementation or mechanistic level. Because it sounds like when you want to gain such understanding, then you end up in this loop that I'm not sure if it makes a lot of sense, because you're just using previous knowledge about the brain, like Dale's law or recurrence or whatnot, to inform the deep neural networks, and then they might behave at the end of the day more like the brain, but they didn't produce that knowledge by themselves in the first place, which is at the end of the day what we want, to generate hypotheses of things that for which we don't know much that are out there, right? Yeah.
I would say, so yeah, the adding of certain anatomical features, obviously the neural network isn't going to discover those features. I mean, that you have to look at the real data to know what the anatomy of the brain is. But by putting them into the network and showing that it can help in a specific computational goal that is connecting implementation, like the implementation level to the computational goal in a way that, you know, if you couldn't get that architectural detail to help you in that goal, then we would have to reconsider our assumptions about its role in the brain, I would think. So it's a little bit of proof of concept that this architectural or biological detail is important for this computational goal by showing in a model that adding that detail helps with that goal. So I think there is a little bit of, they're saying something about the implementation level. The algorithmic level, I think you can probably find cases where there has been something you could call increase in algorithmic understanding. I mean, so the thing that kind of spurred this whole perspective for me on using tools and explicitly testing our tools is because I am working on a project where I'm trying to get an algorithmic level description out of an artificial neural network, and all of the tools that I've tried from neuroscience didn't work that well. Like some of them gave me hypotheses for how the system works, and I was like, oh, I figured it out, I'm gonna write up the paper, but I'm just gonna verify it with this one experiment that I do on the network, and then I do that experiment and it doesn't verify the understanding. And I was like, oh, that led me astray. That wasn't the correct understanding of how this system works. So I am interested and have tried to get a more algorithmic understanding out of these networks and to provide hypotheses for the brain. And I think if I went through the literature, I could find other examples of people that have done that more successfully. I just can't think of them off the top of my head right now.
Great, thanks.
Thanks. I see that Rosa also has a follow-up on this topic.
I think you might have just answered it, but yeah, I was going to ask whether any of these tools in the toolbox have really been able to give us algorithmic understanding or distinguish between distinct algorithmic hypotheses that weren't also different at a computational level.
Yeah, well, this depends on how you split the levels personally.
Computational meaning like, you know, goal or function or task.
Yeah. I mean, so I think that in the experimental literature, there have been times where at least these tools have provided algorithmic type descriptions, whether they're accurate or useful or not, I think is more where the uncertainty is. So I think that they do provide those things where we can tell like a little bit of a story. For example, like the untangling in the visual system. I mean, that's the result of a lot of these kinds of analyses that I've talked about, like doing encoding or decoding type analyses and looking across representational similarity across, you know, brain regions and stuff like that. So I think that there are cases where we've had progress. And in that case, those tools have been kind of studied and looked at in convolutional neural networks, as well as a place where we can like refine them basically and develop more mathematical analyses that kind of represent that hypothesis. And so I think it's still to be seen, you know, exactly how useful that is, that then kind of comes back to the brain and how useful it is in understanding the brain. But yeah, there things that happened, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at specific tools like seems like dimensionality reduction and like latent factor identification might tell you something about, you know, which aspects are causally important, or at least give you candidates for investigating for causal culpability. But it doesn't seem like they really tell you exactly what processes are happening in the way that you might want in this like ideal gold standard algorithmic level explanation. Same with network analyses. Like it doesn't seem like any of these are giving you something as specific as what you would want in that ideal scenario.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I mean, I think it's a process of triangulation and iteration, and you know, you use a bunch of different methods and then you come up with your mechanistic model and all of that. But yeah, I think there is kind of there's in some ways something that we're missing in the toolbox. I don't know what it is. That's part of the problem though. And it could be the case that it's just the thing that will end up, you know, answering some specific question is so specific to that question that you can't create a general thing. Like a lot of things that I'm listing as the tools of systems neuroscience are pretty generic in that they've been applied across a lot of different brain areas and under different circumstances and for different questions and all of that. But maybe the best you can do with that kind of generic tool is just give you these kind of hints of where to look, and then you really have to just become way more specific in how you're analyzing the data and, you know, what experiments you want to do and all of that to make real progress on top of that.
Yeah, so do you think if like Jonas and Cording reran their thing on the microchip with these updated techniques, whether and you know, maybe more honest tasks, do you think they would find something different?
Well, I would say one, I found their results somewhat optimistic, actually. So just for a single round of application of tools, I think they actually were able to recover some aspects of how that system worked. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, there's a sense, obviously people who do kind of methods development, that's its own area, sub area of neuroscience that has its own trends and all of that. And there's a sense that, you know, there's progress. People are supposed to be making better methods. But sometimes that feels like that just means kind of using the newer statistical techniques that are popular at the time. And yeah, it remains to be seen if that's going to bear out into actually producing better hypotheses. I think more with the microprocessor thing, I object more to it being a microprocessor than, you know, than that maybe that's not a fair test of the tools. But yeah, I don't think that the tools even did that poorly given that. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you might think that artificial neural networks have more in common with the microprocessor than they do with the brain.
yeah, I don't. I mean, they're somewhere in between, but they're at least pushing more towards the brain direction than the microprocessor is.
You might think that the kinds of noise that they generate, for example, are more similar to what you might find in a microprocessor, and that maybe in general, the kinds of noise that any system generates is a kind of signature of its mechanism.
Yeah, no, the noise aspect is one where there is an issue. I agree. But in terms of the mindset that systems neuroscientists have, I think they're thinking about artificial neural networks and not microprocessors. And that alone kind of says that, you know, they've been developing these tools with a bit of an ANN model in mind, then we should test them on something like that. And I don't think that any of the people who develop tools in neuroscience would say that they're thinking about
Yeah.
something like a microprocessor and, you know, trying to make tools that would make that system understandable. But obviously some are saying, they're thinking about the brain as a more stochastic system, and, ANNs aren't representing that. So that's a fair critique then.
You might think like the algorithmic level is like the right level at which to try to understand the microprocessor running something, but it's not, like, maybe that's not the right goal for the techniques of systems neuroscience if there isn't like the single algorithmic level for us to aim at.
Yeah, and that's why I don't want to get too tied up in it being like Mars level, but I still think there is something that systems neuroscientists are trying to do. And we should ask if that thing they're trying to do is a valid goal or not, and ask if the tools are getting them to that goal.
I mean, maybe that goal is something like understand the brain at an intermediate level of abstraction that needn't be algorithmic in a Maurian sort of representational way.
Yeah. But yeah, the fact that we don't have good ways of describing what the neuroscientists are even trying to do is a little concerning to me. I think we should reflect on that.